Okay, so I teach medical law and ethics at the University of Kent. I'm also on a research ethics committee in London, the London South East Research Ethics Committee, and I'm on the ethics forum of the National Council for Palliative Care. So although what I'm saying may seem bizarre and is certainly not, the official opinion of these bodies, I have thought about the ethics of it, and I have written about how this particular way of doing things could be something that we could actually make happen. And it seems a self-evidently good idea to me that we should enhance our dying process by taking psychedelics, and the way of doing so is actually something that could happen. So that's my starting point. In terms of what I'm going to be talking about, the starting point is really what constitutes the good death. And I think as we get older, and as our people that we care about get older, this is something that preys on our mind, and we start thinking, well, what would make it better? I think it's really good that I'm following on from the talk on sex and how we can use various drugs to enhance that should we so desire. Because I think that in many ways death is the new sex, and what I mean by that is not just that French statement, le petit mort. It's also the whole idea that once upon a time a lot of the ethical and conversational issues about sex were all about, well, should we or shouldn't we? And maybe we shouldn't because, an unwanted pregnancy might happen. Well, once contraceptives and IVF and all sorts of technologies flooded into being, then suddenly sex and reproduction became divisible, and we became able to talk about aspects of sex and reproduction in very fine terms that we can't actually do with death at present. But I think we're moving towards a situation now where increasingly this is going to be possible. And so the whole idea about choice in death at the minute is all about, well, should we be able to say euthanasia is a good thing, assisted dying is a good thing, or should we keep saying, no, it's a very bad thing? And what kind of reasons are we going to bring out to discuss this? So my position today is that actually there are a whole raft of choices about dying and how we go about it and how we could change the quality of the experience that are actually really important. And one of the things that it seems to me that is possible to make that happen is advances in neuroimaging so that we can tell what's going on with the brain in various states. Because you will have noticed from the talk on sex that people came back and reported on their experience. Well, people usually don't do that with death. And so, the idea that we can have some idea of what the subjective experience of dying might be is problematic without the kind of tools that neuroimaging offers us. So in my article I talked about how we could put people who were dying in neuroimaging machines and actually see what went on and try and match that with subjective experiences of people who'd almost been there. And this is where I'd like a little bit of input from you. How many people have had a near-death experience? Can you wave your hands in the air? Cool. Well, about 10% of the population usually have. How many people had this feeling that they were moving towards a tunnel with a light at the end? Hands up, right up. Not that many. Okay. How many people saw a light and had the light feeling really real and significant? Heaps. Okay. How many couldn't move and felt that you had probably died? And how many have had the out-of-body experience? Yeah. How many people did the life review? Where you go back through all your memories and, yeah, okay. How many people felt bliss, ecstasy, euphoria? All those things that we really like to feel. Okay, lots again. And was there a story involved with it? Did you construct a narrative about what was happening that made a meaningful experience of the whole thing? Yeah. Okay, well, what neuroscience would suggest at the minute is that all those sensations can be located in different processes involved in often the limbic system. So that the tunnel can be caused by low blood flow to the eye's retina. Appearing dead can be rapid eye movement paralysis. The bliss comes from the reward system, and the life review comes from memories involving the hippocampus in flight and flight. Now, given that I've just told you, and you may well know already, that there's some knowledge about why these things happen, how many people feel that makes them less meaningful in some way? Okay, so we're not considering that the mechanisms necessarily take away from the meaning, because one of the arguments with all this is how real are these experiences? And if we know the mechanism of something, does it necessarily take away from whether we should use it or not? And it seems to me that it doesn't. And one of the things that we need to be doing now is directing research into these kinds of areas, because if we look at the health benefits of having spiritual experiences like this, having experiences of intense meaning, there seems to be no doubt whatsoever that both at the end of life and the dying process and throughout life, spiritual meaning is something that makes our lives better, makes us healthier, and so it's a good thing to pursue. And psychedelics enable us to do this without going through many, many years of being in a cave meditating, which is one of their appeals. Okay, so in this session is something about having a demedicalised use of psychedelics. I think there's a lot of evidence to suggest that using psychedelics at the end of life to decrease the experience of pain in, say, cancer patients and increase the spiritual meaning for people who are dying is there and could be fitted under the doctor's duty of beneficence, and I in fact have argued this. But for those of us who want to use it in our ordinary lives and who don't necessarily want it to be under control of the medical profession, there are all sorts of issues about how we're going to get there. There's a lot of movement at the moment towards a demedicalisation of dying. I'm thinking of movements like Exit International, where the idea is that you not only ask for assistance in dying from doctors in order to get access to the particular drugs, you also think about ways you could obtain these drugs in a way that keeps you safe and maintains the quality of your dying. And I think in terms of this, there's all sorts of issues that need to be solved, because what's one of the disadvantages of taking psychedelics, particularly in a dying state? I mean, if you say this to most people in the street, are they going to say, oh gee, what a good idea? Or are they going to say, yes, but? So what kind of buts might occur to us? Huh? An unpleasant experience, yeah. How many people have had bad experiences with recreational psychoactive substance use? Yeah, so if somebody's dying and you give them something and they have a really bad time, this is not good for anybody. So how are we going to make sure that this doesn't happen? Well, I'm trying to read my writing. I'm sorry to say that because my mother is ill and potentially in this state, I haven't prepared this. This is why you're not getting, you know, a pretty PowerPoint with lots of lovely pictures. It seems to me that one of the things we need to do is find out what the dying process actually involves, because at the moment nobody really knows. It's not just in terms of the near-death experience elements that I've spoken to you about. A near-death experience is not the same as dying, although some people who've experienced heart attacks, strokes and so on have had them quite often. But also how it feels as it's happening, what kind of varieties there are, how this might map onto other things like individual differences. For instance, if we look at our genetics, those of us who have more serotonin 2 receptors are more likely to be having mystical experiences. If we look at the borderline between consciousness and rapid eye movement sleep, those of us who fall into that area and often don't have a clear switch between them are more likely to have near-death experiences. So there's a lot of individual difference here, which I think has to be mapped onto the different psychedelics. And also I think we need to map how to elicit the different effects, how to guard against specific people being more likely to have bad times, what maps the bad times, because you know, those of us who've had bad times know that you can't always predict them. And it's not necessarily a function of the quality of the psychoactive substance or your mood. Sometimes these things just happen, and we would want to guard against this. I think I've finished now. That was a quick talk. Does anyone have any questions? Yeah.
How does the study of law sit alongside this particular part of your research?
Okay. Well, we all know things like, you know, many drugs that are interesting to many people are not lawful. Many of them are not treated as medicines which can be supplied by doctors, which is one way of making these access to these kinds of substances easier. Like if we say, okay, we're going to make it so that doctors can prescribe psilocybin to people at the end of life, isn't that great? Then that's one way of doing it. It's a different way of saying all these drugs should be made lawful and we should have access to them without the mediation of doctors as gatekeepers. So that's one of the debates. Another of the debates is how this fits in with the whole law on euthanasia and when we can ask someone to help us die and when that's a very bad thing. There's also the law on enhancement. When is this okay? Is it something that should be banned as unnatural and interfering with human nature, etc., etc.? So lots of bodies of law intersect with this. Yeah? Yeah?
Thank you. I think this is a really important topic. I just wanted to make a comment and just see what you think about this idea of a bad experience.
Yeah.
Because I think there's a problem with seeing it in too black and white a way, because I think personally my own bad experiences 30 years ago, I think ended up feeling that way because I didn't have a way to work with what was coming up.
Yeah.
So I think it's important to have the point of view and the mindset of the person that, yeah, difficult things may come up, but if you have the support
Yeah.
It may be very good.
I think that's a very good point, because there are movements at the moment towards having people trained as psychopomps, someone who will accompany you on the death journey, who will see you through any hesitations or upsets you may have, and who has experienced themselves with the particular substance so that they're able to do that. I think another point with bad experiences is that sometimes when we reflect on them later, in fact, there are important things that we needed to know. It's just that if you're dying, you're not going to get a chance to do that. So, yeah, thank you.
Maybe it's better to do it beforehand.
I think, yeah. I mean, it may well be that, you know, if you do a lot of practice before you get to the enhancing the dying process, you are advantaged. That seems highly likely. Yeah.
Did you speak about dying, like a process that starts a certain date? Isn't dying a process that starts today when you're born?
Oh, well, there's this whole thing about life as a fatal disease. That's true. I mean, nobody gets out of being alive. Yeah. But in terms of making the actual experience of dying as well as our lives a spiritual experience, I think that, you know, many people have been in favour of this. Aldous Huxley, for instance, you know, there are accounts of how it can be good for the person concerned, good for those around them, and many of us might think that we would like it to happen for us, not only practicing, but while we're actually dying. Yeah.
I've recently read a paper by Walter Pankey, the famous one from the 60s,
Oh, yeah.
about LSD for the end of life.
Yeah.
And I was wondering what you thought about the idea of not just the dying person, but also their relatives sharing a sort of a ritual, which, because often the problem that I see in when someone is dying, they're willing to face it themselves, but the relatives can't face it at all and are really struggling and are not encouraging the dying person to talk about it. And a shared ritual can perhaps unlock some of those emotions and allow them to give and receive love and move past grudges and so on.
I can see all of the arguments for this. Many people are uncomfortable discussing dying before it happens. Many families come to the deathbed or dying bed of their loved person without having sorted out an awful lot of issues. And I think that's one of the difficulties with everyone sitting down and having the ritual. It's great if you've sorted out a lot of your difficulties first. If you haven't, and it degenerates into who's going to get what from the estate, then it's not really a good way of dying for the person concerned.
Yeah, possibly not. I think there would probably need to be some way
Of funneling into it gradually. Yeah, well, it'd have to be gates, I think, on the way in, if it were going to remain to be a good experience for everyone concerned. Yeah?
Yeah, I really want to thank you for this. I think that dying is this kind of like lost art, and it's a very natural process that we've forgotten how to do. We've forgotten how to be with people who are dying.
Yeah.
The work that we're doing at Hopkins with psilocybin suggests that high doses, at least, can give people access to their own death experience. And it's highly individual. It's often really terrifying, but it ends up having lots of long-term positive effects. And
Yeah.
that's pretty healthy people. So I guess I would, I've talked to a few people about what would be a great compound, and most people have said psilocybin would be very useful because even if it's difficult, if you hold the right space, it often ends up being very, positive in the long run, even if that long run is only a few days. The second thing I want to say is, if you look at the medical marijuana movement, it started with helping treat people who were dying of HIV and AIDS in San Francisco in America. And, this idea of psychedelic hospice, it might be that people want to start dying a certain way and they just start doing it whether it's legal or not. And I think we have to be kind of prepared for people who are dying are not going to wait for the law to change to do it a certain way. And we just, as a community, I think, need to get ready for that to cause a little bit of a wave. And it actually could end up helping all of the science and the public policy side, because when people are confronted with an illness themselves, they're much more likely to support a cause. And and we're all going to die.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's one argument for saying that some people would agree to die in a neuroimaging machine, bizarre as that might be, to kind of help this cause. One of the issues with this, because I am arguing that it should be demedicalised, that there should be some sort of, you know, bottom-up movement as you've described. And I think as the baby boomers get older, you know, baby boomers are used to being able to buy anything that they want and make things work the way that they want them to work. I think it's becoming increasingly likely that this kind of thing will happen. Yeah?
Since I first put my hand up, you mentioned Huxley.
Yeah.
It took some when he was dying.
Yeah.
Pointedly, but in fact also his wife reported him having poltergeist phenomenon. So that's quite interesting, I think.
Well, he was enjoying it, and so he had got her to give him a second dose, which I think is, you know, an accolade in itself. But yeah, I mean, there's lots of things about the dying process that we don't know, and a lot of them seem to include something called delirium, and a lot of the treatment that's given to people at the end of life is to kind of calm all that down so the relatives don't get upset because, oh dear, you know. And so a lot of the treatment's for the benefit of the relatives rather than for the person themselves, so that this picture of the peaceful death can be maintained. But we don't know what that's actually doing to the subjective experience of it, and I think this is deeply problematic. Yeah?
This kind of ties into your answer to the last question. A lot of the drugs that are given at end of life quite routinely, particularly with degenerative illnesses like cancer and morphine and fentanyl and so forth, have psychedelic effects. It's perfectly possible to have a full-blown trip of morphine, as I discovered when I was having a hip replacement. But nonetheless, I think with all this focus on the external appearance and reducing the appearance of distress, there's a definite trend at the moment of inducing these psychedelic experiences without any preventative measures, without any quality control or setting. Would you agree with that or disagree? So what?
I think quality control measures are really, really important, and it's not just of the experience, it's also of the substances that are used, which is where that whole bottom-up movement, you know, if you get a bad dose of something, then that really, really doesn't help. And that is a really strong argument, I think, for delegalisation. Yeah?
We're talking about the end of life as though it's got a set duration, kind of. But what sort of margins do you see treatment with psychedelia being useful? Because I'm just thinking that it's quite uncomfortable trying to fall asleep if you're still tripping.
Well, this is where looking at the experience of dying comes in, because, you know, the point you were making before about having the whole family around and engaging in some sort of, you know, peaceful goodbye process. You've also got to look at the biological characteristics of the person concerned, and often they're very tired, you know, they're very weak. So you'd have to think about when the timing would happen for all these things as well, which, you know, I think it's a good point. Often the drug can be wanting to continue, but the body can be feeling that actually, you know, it's had enough now, thanks. So yeah, that's where I think the whole process in terms of individual differences, specific reasons for dying and so on, need to be mapped in quite a complex fashion so that the details are available and a safe plan can be set out. Yeah?
That can't be verified scientifically. The first near-death experience that I had was without drugs, it was out of the blue, wasn't following any sort of course of meditation or anything at all, just anything like that. It was a dislocation of the experience of death, which I'm quite convinced I experienced, and the actual physical death. This was 27 years ago. And that's left me with a sense that it takes quite a long run-up, hopefully a long run-up, to the point of death. In this culture, we don't prepare ourselves to death, as they do in other legacy cultures, where you almost have a midwife to help you move on.
Yeah.
And then it's start getting swept under the carpet and scattered and sort of, you know, it all gets cremated with lots of gas or stuck in the ground. But we don't have any sort of sense of looking forward to death in our
No. I think our culture has buried it, if that doesn't sound too bizarre. Whereas if you look at the number of us that have had these experiences with or without drugs, actually I think, you know, it does demonstrate that there's a body of evidence to build on in terms of preparing us. And that would be a very good thing.